This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this immersive journey into the Danish invasion of England. In this narration, we explore the transformative era of the Viking Age, from the terrifying first raids at Lindisfarne to the rise of Cnut the Great's vast North Sea Empire. We will examine the psychological shock of the Scourge of God, the birth of the Danelaw, and the fierce struggle for survival that ultimately forged a unified English identity. Prepare for a gripping account of epic battles, cultural collisions, and the legendary figures who shaped a nation. Chapter 1. The Scourge of God, the psychological shock of the first raids. The year was 789, and the coast of Wessex was as quiet as it had been for generations. On the Isle of Portland, a royal official named Biduherd, the Reeve of Dorchester, spotted 3 ships approaching the shore. In that era, the sight of a sail was usually a cause for professional curiosity rather than terror. Biduherd was a man of the law, an administrator whose duty was to identify foreign merchants, ensure they paid their tolls, and guide them to the king's town for proper processing. He rode out to meet the newcomers with the confidence of a man who believed the world operated under a shared set of rules. According to Ethelwerd's chronicle, the Reeve spoke to the visitors in an authoritative tone, expecting the standard deference shown to a representative of the crown. He likely demanded to know their business and insisted they follow him to the royal vill. Instead of reaching for coin purses or trade manifests, the men from the ships reached for their weapons. They were not used to such bureaucratic posturing, nor did they recognize the authority of a West Saxon official. They struck Biduherd down where he stood, killing him and his attendants without hesitation. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle later noted with a sense of grim finality that these were the first ships of Danish men that sought the land of the English nation. While the chronicle used the term Danish, a label that would eventually become a generic English catch-all for all Scandinavians, these specific raiders hailed from Hordaland in modern-day Norway. This distinction is vital as it marks the beginning of a Norwegian-led expansion that would first target the northern and western fringes of the British Isles. This encounter was more than a localized tragedy. It was a fundamental breakdown of the social and diplomatic expectations that had governed the British Isles for centuries. Biduherd died because he could not conceive of a visitor who did not respect the office of a royal reeve. However, the English leadership was not entirely oblivious to the growing danger on the seas. A Kentish charter from 792 reveals that King Offa of Mercia was already exempting certain monasteries from military service, with the notable exception of service required against sea-borne pirates. This suggests that while the general population remained in a state of innocence, the high command of the English kingdoms was beginning to sense a shift in the maritime environment. This initial loss of innocence was merely a prelude to the spiritual and psychological earthquake that would strike 4 years later, further up the coast in the Kingdom of Northumbria. On June 8, 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne, also known as the Holy Island, became the site of an event that would haunt the Christian world for centuries. Lindisfarne was not just any monastery. It was the preeminent center of Christianity in northern England, a place of pilgrimage that held the sacred relics of St. Cuthbert. To the people of the time, the monastery was a thin place, where the barrier between heaven and earth was translucent. It was protected not by stone walls or standing armies, but by the perceived power of the saints and the inherent sanctity of the ground itself. The monks lived in a state of intentional vulnerability, devoted to worship and the preservation of knowledge. Among their treasures was the St. Cuthbert Gospel, a pocket-sized book of the Gospel of John that had been placed in the saint's coffin. This manuscript, which survives today with its original 7th century red leather binding, represents the pinnacle of the intellectual and artistic heritage the monks sought to protect. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the year leading up to the raid was filled with terrifying omens. Great sheets of lightning flashed through the sky, whirlwinds whipped the air, and fiery dragons were seen flying through the clouds. A massive famine followed these portents, leaving the population in a state of heightened anxiety. When the Viking ships finally appeared on the horizon and landed at Lindisfarne, the reality proved more horrific than the omens. The raiders acted with a savagery that the English found impossible to categorize. They didn't just steal, they desecrated. They trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars, and seized every treasure the church possessed. Some of the monks were slaughtered in the sanctuary, their blood spattering the very stones they had spent their lives kneeling upon. Others were dragged away in chains to be sold as slaves, while many were simply thrown into the sea to drown. The news of the massacre at Lindisfarne sent tremors through the courts of Europe. Alcuin of York, a renowned scholar then serving at the court of Charlemagne, was devastated when he heard the reports. In his letters to King Aethelred of Northumbria and the Bishop of Lindisfarne, Alcuin struggled to find a theological explanation for why God would allow such a tragedy to befall his most faithful servants. He noted that for nearly 350 years the English had inhabited this lovely land, and never before had such a terror appeared. He described the site of the church of St. Cuthbert despoiled of its ornaments, and the bodies of saints trampled like dung in the street. The psychological impact of this raid cannot be overstated. For the Anglo-Saxons, the world was a hierarchy ordered by God. If the most sacred place in the kingdom could be destroyed by heathen men, it suggested that the spiritual shield over England had been lowered. Alcuin, searching for a cause, suggested that the raid was divine retribution for the sins of the people. He pointed to recent incidents of regicide and instability within the Northumbrian royal line, and even chastised the English for copying the pagan hairstyles and fashions of the very men who now menaced them. This created a profound sense of existential dread. The Vikings were seen not just as human enemies, but as the Scourge of God, a physical manifestation of divine displeasure. From the Viking perspective, the choice of Lindisfarne was driven by a completely different set of logic. They were not motivated by a desire to destroy Christianity, so much as they were drawn to movable wealth. Monasteries were essentially the banks of the early medieval world. They were repositories for gold, silver, and precious stones, often shaped into elaborate gospel books, crucifixes, and reliquaries. Because these institutions were populated by non-violent religious men, they were the easiest targets imaginable. The Vikings, coming from a culture that valued martial prowess and the acquisition of glory, saw no honor in the monks' lack of defense. To a Norse warrior, if you could not defend your wealth, you did not deserve to keep it. This clash of cultures was exacerbated by the Viking religious worldview. They followed gods like Odin, the All-Father, who rewarded those who died fiercely in battle with a place in the halls of Valhalla. Proficiency in combat was the highest virtue. While it was considered dishonorable to kill one's own kinsmen or those who had surrendered under specific conditions, those outside their faith and language were fair game. The Vikings utilized their advanced maritime technology to exploit the country's complete unpreparedness. Their longships, with their shallow drafts, allowed them to sail far up rivers and land directly on beaches, making virtually every settlement in England a potential target. The raid on Lindisfarne was followed a year later by an attack on the Monkwearmouth Jarrow Abbey, the former home of the Venerable Bede. This time, the Vikings met more resistance than they expected. Their leaders were killed, and as they attempted to escape, their ships were beached at Tynemouth by a storm. The local population, fueled by the rage of the previous year's atrocities, fell upon the crews and killed them all. This brief victory provided a respite of about 40 years for England, during which the Vikings shifted their focus to Ireland and Scotland. In Scotland, the impact was equally devastating. The monastery at Iona was burned in 802, and in a subsequent raid in 806, 68 monks were slaughtered. The survivors eventually fled to Kells in Ireland, carrying with them the unfinished Book of Kells to save it from the flames. These raids were an assault on the collective memory of the British Isles, as each monastery burned represented the loss of libraries and chronicles. The political stability of the north was shattered in 839 when a massive Viking fleet moved into the heart of the Pictish and Gaelic territories. In a single catastrophic battle, the Vikings killed Uwen, king of the Picts, and Ed, king of Dalriata, along with countless members of the northern nobility. This massacre of kings created a power vacuum that would eventually lead to the unification of Scotland under Kenneth MacAlpin, as the surviving local leaders realized they could no longer stand alone against the seaborne threat. By the 830s, the raids resumed in southern England with renewed intensity. In 835, the Isle of Sheppey in Kent was ravaged. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 840 records that King Ethelwulf of Wessex was defeated at Carhampton after 35 Viking ships landed. The scale of the attacks was beginning to grow. No longer were these just 3-ship raiding parties. They were becoming organized expeditions. The heathen men were no longer just seasonal visitors who appeared in the summer and vanished with the autumn winds. They began to stay. The psychological landscape of England was permanently altered by these early encounters. The English had to adapt to a world where the coastline was a source of danger rather than just a boundary for trade. The rigid social hierarchy found itself unable to respond to the hit-and-run tactics of the Norsemen. The traditional method of raising a local militia was too slow. By the time the local burgess had gathered their men and reached the coast, the Vikings had usually plundered the target and were already back at sea. This era of raids also created a crisis of the sacred. If the church was the center of community life and the source of moral order, its repeated desecrations suggested a world falling into chaos. The Vikings appeared to the English as a force of nature, unpredictable and utterly alien. They wore different clothes and maintained distinct, jarring appearances, often shaving the backs of their heads while leaving the hair in front long and shaggy. They spoke a language that, while carrying familiar Germanic roots, was used to bark commands during the slaughter of priests. The Anglo-Saxons, who had themselves arrived as invaders centuries earlier, now found themselves in the position of the civilized defenders, being overrun by barbarians. The early Viking Age in Britain was defined by this sharp, painful transition from a collection of isolated, relatively stable kingdoms to a besieged society. The monasteries, once the beacons of light in the so-called Dark Ages, were being extinguished one by one. This forced a radical reorganization of English society. The kings of the Heptarchy, Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia, began to realize that their internal rivalries were a luxury they could no longer afford. The heathen men did not care about the border between Mercia and East Anglia. They only cared about the gold in the next church. As the mid-9th century approached, the nature of the Viking threat underwent another qualitative shift, as the scattered raids of the previous decades began to coalesce into a concerted effort to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms entirely. Could the fractured English kingdoms find a way to unite before the raiders decided to stop seeking gold and start seeking land? Chapter 2. The Danelaw, Partition, and the Birth of England. Chapter 2. The Danelaw, Partition, and the Birth of England. The arrival of the great heathen army in 865 signaled a departure from the opportunistic coastal strikes of previous decades, moving instead toward a coordinated campaign of territorial acquisition. While the initial landing in East Anglia and the subsequent fall of York established a Scandinavian foothold, it was the relentless pressure of the following years that brought the English kingdoms to the brink of extinction. By 871, the conflict had intensified into what chroniclers would remember as the Year of Battles. This was not merely a continuation of the 865 invasion, but was bolstered by the arrival of the Great Summer Army, a massive reinforcement led by the Viking king Bagseg. The presence of two distinct Viking hosts made the war a grueling contest of attrition that Wessex, the last kingdom standing, was ill-equipped to sustain. The reality of this occupation is vividly preserved in the archaeological record, most notably at Repton in Derbyshire. Here, the great heathen army established a winter camp in 873 to 874, incorporating the existing Anglo-Saxon church into a D-shaped fortress. Excavations revealed a mass grave containing the remains of at least 264 individuals. For years, the dating of these remains was a source of scientific controversy. Radiocarbon results initially suggested the bones were deposited over several centuries, which contradicted the historical narrative of a single winter camp. However, modern analysis has resolved this discrepancy through the understanding of the marine reservoir effect. Because the Viking diet was heavily reliant on fish, the carbon they consumed from the sea made their bones appear significantly older than they actually were. Once adjusted for this old carbon, the Repton remains were confirmed to be a snapshot of the great heathen army's casualties, providing a visceral link to the warriors who nearly dismantled England. The reality of this occupation is vividly preserved in the archaeological record, most notably at Repton in Derbyshire. Here, the great heathen army established a winter camp in 873 to 874, incorporating the existing Anglo-Saxon church into a D-shaped fortress. Excavations revealed a mass grave containing the remains of at least 264 individuals. For years, the dating of these remains was a source of scientific controversy. Radiocarbon results initially suggested the bones were deposited over several centuries, which contradicted the historical narrative of a single winter camp. However, modern analysis has resolved this discrepancy through the understanding of the marine reservoir effect. Because the Viking diet was heavily reliant on fish, the carbon they consumed from the sea made their bones appear significantly older than they actually were. Once adjusted for this old carbon, the Repton remains were confirmed to be a snapshot of the great heathen army's casualties, providing a visceral link to the warriors who nearly dismantled England. The legal and social continuity of the Danelaw is illustrated by sites like Thinghow, a meeting place located in Sherwood Forest. Here, the Danish settlers gathered to resolve disputes and enact laws, mirroring the Thing assemblies of their homelands. Even the sites of punishment reflected a blend of traditions. At Walkington Wold in Yorkshire, an execution cemetery reveals a continuity of judicial practice where the local population, whether of Saxon or Danish descent, maintained traditional sites for the disposal of those who broke the law. This suggests that the Danelaw was not a lawless frontier, but a highly structured society that emphasized local autonomy and the rights of the sokemen, free peasants who held a status more independent than their counterparts in the south. Alfred realized that the military defense of Wessex required more than just walls. It required a total reorganization of the English state. He developed a network of 33 fortified burhs, positioned with such strategic precision that no person in the kingdom was more than a 15-mile radius from a place of refuge. These burhs were connected by herepaths, or military roads, specifically designed to allow the rapid movement of the fyrd, the national militia, against an invading hare, the Viking army. To support this infrastructure, Alfred utilized the Burgel Hidage, a sophisticated administrative document that calculated the number of men required to garrison and maintain the walls of each town based on the surrounding acreage of land. These burhs were connected by herepaths, or military roads, specifically designed to allow the rapid movement of the fyrd, the national militia, against an invading hare, the Viking army. To support this infrastructure, Alfred utilized the Burgel Hidage, a sophisticated administrative document that calculated the number of men required to garrison and maintain the walls of each town based on the surrounding acreage of land. However, Alfred's most enduring contribution to the unification of England was not military, but cultural. He viewed the Viking invasions as a divine punishment for a neglect of learning that had seen the once great libraries of Northumbria and Mercia fall into decay. Alfred believed that a kingdom could only be defended by men who understood their own history and faith. He famously lamented that there were very few men south of the Humber who could understand their rituals in English or translate a letter from Latin. To remedy this, he embarked on an ambitious program of educational reform, promoting literacy in the English language so that the books most necessary for all men to know could be read by the rising generation of the GNS and clergy. Alfred himself took part in this work, translating or commissioning the translation of key texts, including Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. By elevating the English language to a medium of high culture and law, Alfred provided his subjects with a shared identity that transcended local tribal loyalties. This cultural unification was the essential foundation upon which his successors would build a political one. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, another of Alfred's projects, served as a national narrative that framed the House of Wessex as the legitimate defenders of all Christian English people, regardless of whether they lived in Wessex, Mercia, or the fringes of the Danelaw. The linguistic legacy of this period remains embedded in the very fabric of modern English. As the Danish settlers plowed and supported themselves, the daily interaction between Old English and Old Norse speakers led to a unique linguistic blending. Because the two languages shared Germanic roots, they were somewhat mutually intelligible, but the contact accelerated the stripping away of complex grammatical endings. This pidginization in the borderlands led to the simplified analytic structure of English we use today. The Norse impact is visible in thousands of place names ending in by, village, thorp, hamlet, and thwaite, clearing, but it is most profound in our core vocabulary. Basic words like sky, window, law, and egg, as well as the essential third-person pronouns they, them, and their, were adopted from the Scandinavian settlers. The economic vitality of the Danelaw also transformed the English landscape. The Vikings were sophisticated traders who integrated England into a vast commercial network stretching from the North Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. Nowhere was this more evident than in Jorvik, York. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate have revealed a bustling metropolis of craftsmen and merchants. Finds include silk from Byzantium, cowrie shells from the Red Sea, and amber from the Baltic, alongside evidence of large-scale glassmaking and leatherworking. The Viking elite in the 5 boroughs minted their own coins, often blending Christian and pagan imagery, such as the famous St. Peter's pence coins that featured a Viking sword alongside a Christian cross. The political reconquest of the Danelaw was a multi-generational project led by Alfred's children and grandchildren. His daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, proved to be a brilliant strategist, working in tandem with her brother, King Edward the Elder. Together, they moved the frontier northward, building new burhs to secure every mile of reclaimed territory. Ethelfled's capture of Derby in 917 and Leicester in 918 broke the back of the 5 boroughs' independence. The final unification was achieved by Alfred's grandson Ethelstan, who in 927 captured York and drove out the last Scandinavian king of the city. At a meeting at Emont Bridge, the kings of the Scots, the Welsh, and the Northumbrians acknowledged Ethelstan as their overlord. He was the first to style himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English, and Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. Despite this political triumph, the Danelaw remained a culturally distinct region. The Scandinavian influence was so deeply ingrained that even after the expulsion of the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, in 954, the north of England maintained its own legal customs and social character. The House of Wessex had succeeded in creating a single kingdom, but it was a kingdom that had to accommodate a large, integrated, and influential Anglo-Danish population. This hybrid identity was the new reality of England, a land where the sound of the church bell and the memory of the Thing assembly now existed side by side. The question remained whether this unified state, born from the necessity of defense, could survive the internal pressures of its own success and the inevitable return of the Sea Kings. Chapter 3: The St. Brice's Day Massacre and the Blood-Feud. The relative peace that had characterized the middle of the 10th century began to dissolve in a series of dark portents and political bloodletting. In March 978, the young King Edward was mysteriously murdered at Corfe Castle, an event that sent a shudder through the English psyche. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, ever sensitive to the spiritual climate of the realm, noted that in the same year a bloody cloud was seen in the likeness of fire, manifesting most often at midnight. This celestial omen was interpreted as a sign of gathering darkness, a prophecy of natural disaster and social ruin. Into this atmosphere of dread stepped Edward's half-brother Ethelred, a boy of barely 12 years. He would come to be known by the epithet Unread, a play on his name which meant well-advised. It is a historical irony that this nickname, the Unready, was first recorded in the 1180s, over 150 years after his death. In its original context, unread did not imply a lack of preparation, but rather no counsel or bad counsel. Specifically, it referred to the toxic political environment of his court, where a bitter struggle had erupted between the gentry and the clergy. The nobility were deeply resentful of the massive land gifts Ethelred had made to the church, and pressured him to revoke them, leading to a breakdown in the consensus required to govern a kingdom under threat. The renewed Viking assault began as a series of small opportunistic probes along the southern and western coasts. In 980, raiders struck Hampshire and Thanet. In 981, 7 ships sacked Southampton. And in 982, 3 ships plundered Portland. These early parties were led by minor chieftains, much like the raiders of the 8th century, seeking easy wealth in a kingdom they perceived as weak. Ethelred's response to these incursions was often characterized by a strange blend of ineptitude and spite. In 993, after the ealdorman Elfric deserted the English forces, the king sought a target for his frustration. He ordered the blinding of Elfgar, Elfric's son, as a punishment for the father's treason. This act of cruelty against a youth did nothing to deter the Vikings, but it signaled to the English nobility that their king was a man whose vengeance was as unpredictable as it was misplaced. When local populations failed to repel the raiders, the king sometimes turned his own troops against them as punishment, such as when he ravaged the city of Rochester because the locals had not shown enough spirit in their own defense. The most significant of these early encounters took place on August 10, 991, near the town of Malden in Essex. A large Danish force, led by the Norwegian prince Olaf Tryggvason, occupied Northey Island in the river Blackwater. The island was connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that was only accessible at low tide. Standing on the shore was Berthnoth, the ealdorman of Essex, a veteran warrior who refused to be intimidated by the multitude of the enemy. The Danes, shouting across the water, demanded a payment of tribute in exchange for peace. Berthnoth's reply was legendary. He told them that the only tribute they would receive would be the points of spears and the edges of ancient swords. As the tide ebbed, the Danes began to stream over the causeway, but the path was so narrow that a few determined Saxons were able to cut them down one by one. In a moment that historians still debate, the Danes called out to Berthnoth, asking to be allowed to cross the causeway unhindered so that the two sides could fight on equal terms. In an act of overmode, or overcourage, Berthnoth agreed. He allowed the invaders to reach the mainland, and a brutal traditional shield wall battle ensued. The tide of the battle turned when Berthnoth was cut down. Seeing their leader fall, a Saxon named Godric seized Berthnoth's horse and fled the field. Many of the English troops, seeing the commander's horse galloping away, assumed Berthnoth himself was retreating, and the army dissolved into a panicked rout. Only Berthnoth's personal household troops remained, fighting to the last man. Chapter 4. Cnut the Great and the North Sea Empire. In the summer of 1015, the horizon off the coast of Sandwich was transformed by the arrival of a fleet so magnificent that contemporary observers struggled to find words to describe it. This was a return to the very waters where, only a year earlier, Cnut had been forced to retreat following the sudden death of his father, Sweyn Forkbeard. Upon his departure in 1014, he had left behind a chilling testament to his ruthlessness, mutilating the English hostages he held at Sandwich by cutting off their hands, ears, and noses before sailing for Denmark. Now he had returned not as a fleeing prince, but as the leader of a professional invasion force. This was not a collection of loosely coordinated raiding bands, but a disciplined army led by the young Danish prince. According to the Cnut saga, Cnut was a figure of imposing presence. Exceptionally tall and strong, he was described as the handsomest of men, despite a thin, hooked nose. He possessed a fair complexion, a fine head of hair, and eyes that were said to be better than those of other men in both their beauty and the keenness of their sight. He had come to reclaim the throne his father had briefly held, and he brought with him an armada that flashed with gold and silver. The Encomium Emma Reginae notes that the ships were adorned with golden lions and bulls, their horns shining in the sun, creating a terrifying spectacle of wealth and military might. This expedition was composed entirely of mature, noble warriors. There were no slaves or low-born recruits, only elite professionals who scorned the speed of horsemen because of their own readiness for battle. Cnut's force of roughly 10,000 men and 200 longships was bolstered by powerful allies, including Polish troops provided by his relative, Duke Boleslav the Brave, and a contingent of Swedes. He was also supported by Eric Håkanarsson, the Earl of Lod, and the legendary Thorkel the Tall. This was a coalition of the entire Scandinavian and Baltic world, focused with singular purpose on the conquest of England. The campaign began with a brutal efficiency that targeted the West Saxon heartland, harrying Dorset, Wiltshire, and Somerset. At this critical moment, the English defense was crippled by internal division. King Ethelred was gravely ill, leaving leadership to his son Edmund Ironside. However, the treacherous Edric Striona, the earldoman of Mercia, defected to Cnut with 40 ships, effectively handing control of the seas to the Danes. Throughout the winter of 1015 and into the spring of 1016, the war became a series of grueling maneuvers across the frozen landscape of central England. Cnut struck into the northern shires, forcing Earl Uhtred of Northumbria to submit. Cnut, however, was not interested in Uhtred's loyalty. He arranged for the Earl to be murdered during the submission ceremony and replaced him with his own brother-in-law, Eric of Lothier. The death of King Ethelred on April 23, 1016, intensified the struggle. England was now a country with two kings, Edmund, elected by the citizens of London, and Cnut, supported by an assembly in Southampton. Cnut realized that London was the key to the kingdom and launched a sophisticated siege. When the fortification of London Bridge proved impassable, the Danes dug a massive channel on the south bank of the river, allowing them to drag their ships around the bridge and blockade the city from the west. Edmund Ironside managed to escape the blockade and raise the local levies of Wessex. In a series of rapid engagements at Penselwood and Shurston, he fought the Danes to a standstill, eventually breaking the siege of London. However, the climax of the conquest took place on October 18, 1016, at the Battle of Asandun. While the exact location remains a subject of historical interest, with Ashton near Saffron Walden and Ashington near Rochford being the primary candidates, the impact of the engagement was total. In the heat of the battle, Eadric Striana carried out a devastating betrayal. He and his contingent, specifically identified in the sources as the Mazevians, turned and fled the field. The Danish lines broke through the English centre, and the resulting slaughter claimed nearly the entire nobility of the English nation, including Ulfsidel of East Anglia and several prominent bishops. The subsequent Treaty of Olney partitioned the realm, but the arrangement lasted only weeks until Edmund Ironside died suddenly on November 30th, 1016. At the age of 21, Cnut was recognized as the sole king of all England. His reign began with a cold-blooded consolidation of power. On Christmas Day 1017, he ordered the execution of the duplicitous Eadric Striana. He also moved against the old royal line, ordering the murder of Edmund's brother, Edwig. In a move of international intrigue, Cnut exiled Edmund's 2 infant sons to Sweden with the intent that they be killed. However, they were secretly spared and sent to Kiev, where the queen was Cnut's own daughter. To further secure his position, Cnut married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Athelred, linking himself to the previous dynasty and neutralizing the threat of Norman intervention. Once his hold on the jewel of England was secure, Cnut demonstrated the staggering wealth of his new prize. In 1018, he dismissed the bulk of his invasion fleet, paying them a grand Danegeld of 82,500 pounds of silver. Of this astronomical sum, 10,500 pounds came from London alone, with the remaining 72,000 pounds drawn from the rest of the realm. This payment not only secured the loyalty of his departing warriors, but also signaled that England was now the economic engine of a burgeoning empire. Cnut did not treat the land as a province to be plundered, but as his primary seat of power. He worked with Archbishop Wulfstan of York to draft laws based on the codes of King Edgar, signaling his intent to rule as a traditional English monarch. This period of stability saw a unique administrative blending. While the broader structures of the English state remained, Cnut introduced Scandinavian practices to the areas under Danish influence. In these regions, money began to be calculated in marks and oars rather than shillings, and land was divided into ploughlands and oxgangs instead of the traditional hides and vergates. To maintain order, Cnut established a professional household guard known as the Thingolid. The prestige of this elite unit was such that its members are commemorated on several Swedish runestones, illustrating the deep and ongoing connection between the English court and the Scandinavian heartland. Cnut's relationship with the Church was a cornerstone of his domestic policy. He was a lavish benefactor of monasteries and oversaw the 1020 dedication of a stone minster at Assanden, either Ashton or Ashington, to commemorate the fallen of both sides. His piety gained him the support of the influential clergy and helped bridge the cultural gap between his Danish followers and English subjects. The true scale of his achievement became apparent as he expanded his influence. In 1018, he claimed the Danish throne, and in 1026 he defeated the combined Swedish and Norwegian fleets at the Battle of the Helgia. Shortly after, he asserted his dominance by ordering the execution of his brother-in-law, Ulf Jarl, in a church in Roskilde. By 1027, Cnut was the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, a status recognized during his pilgrimage to Rome for the coronation of Emperor Conrad II. While there, he negotiated a reduction in tolls for English and Danish pilgrims and arranged a marriage between his daughter Gunhild and the future Henry III. His reach extended even to the northern reaches of the British Isles. In 1027, 3 Scottish kings, including High King Malcolm and the Sea King Ecmarcock mac Ragnail, ruler of Galloway and the Isle of Man, submitted to Cnut. This submission solidified his status as the head of a maritime thalassocracy that included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. However, the North Sea Empire was inherently fragile, relying on Cnut's personal authority and his ability to find loyal regions. In Norway, his appointment of his son Sweyn and his mother Elfgifu proved disastrous, as their attempt to impose Danish taxes led to widespread rebellion. Cnut himself seemed to recognize the difficulty of maintaining such a vast union, as he appointed different sons as heirs to his various kingdoms, rather than attempting to leave the empire to a single successor. Cnut the Great died at Shaftesbury on November 12, 1035, and was buried at Winchester. He left behind a kingdom that was more unified and administratively advanced than the one he had found, but his death immediately triggered a succession crisis. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, were soon locked in a bitter struggle for the throne, and the vast Scandinavian empire he had built began to disintegrate. The collapse of this empire and the subsequent restoration of the House of Wessex would create the very conditions of instability and disputed succession that eventually drew the eyes of a new generation of ambitious northern conquerors across the English Channel. Chapter 5: The Ghost of the North Sea Empire. The victory of William the Conqueror at Hastings in 1066 is often framed as the definitive conclusion to the Viking story in England. Yet for the new Norman king, the Scandinavian threat remained the most perilous challenge of his reign. While the death of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge had removed one claimant, it did not extinguish the ambitions of the Danish crown. King Sweyn II Estridsson, the nephew of Cnut the Great, viewed the Norman presence not as a conquest, but as a temporary interruption of his family's rightful rule. Sweyn's claim was rooted in both blood and a perceived promise made by Edward the Confessor. To the Danes, William was an interloper, and the English throne remained a prize that belonged to the House of Cnut. William was acutely aware of this Danish anxiety. In 1069, as rumors of a massive fleet gathering in the Baltic reached his court, William dispatched a diplomatic mission led by Æthelcig, the abbot of St. Augustine's, to Denmark. Æthelcig's task was to dissuade Sweyn from intervening, but the mission failed to halt the momentum of the Danish claim. Sweyn had spent years consolidating his power and was now ready to strike. He assembled a multinational force that reflected the vast reach of the Viking world, recruiting warriors not only from Norway, Frisia, and Saxony, but also from as far afield as Poland and Lithuania. William was acutely aware of this Danish anxiety. In 1069, as rumors of a massive fleet gathering in the Baltic reached his court, William dispatched a diplomatic mission led by Æthelcig, the abbot of St. Augustine's, to Denmark. Æthelcig's task was to dissuade Sweyn from intervening, but the mission failed to halt the momentum of the Danish claim. Sweyn had spent years consolidating his power and was now ready to strike. He assembled a multinational force that reflected the vast reach of the Viking world, recruiting warriors not only from Norway, Frisia, and Saxony, but also from as far afield as Poland and Lithuania. The invasion was triggered by a bloody uprising in Northumbria. In January 1069, the local population in Durham slaughtered William's newly appointed Earl, Robert de Comines, and his entire retinue. The rebels appealed to Sweyn for aid, and by August, a fleet of nearly 300 ships appeared off the English coast. Commanded by Sweyn's sons Harold and Cnut and his brother Asbjorn, the armada probed the southern defenses at Dover and Norwich before finding a warmer welcome in the Humber estuary. Here the Danes were joined by English resistance leaders, including the claimant Edgar Atheling. The combined force seized York, momentarily shattering the illusion of Norman control over the north. William's response was a masterclass in scorched-earth warfare and cynical diplomacy. He marched north and initiated the Harrying of the North, a campaign of systematic destruction that left Yorkshire a wasteland. However, the Danish fleet remained a potent threat. William chose to buy what he could not easily conquer. He entered into negotiations with the Danish commanders, offering a massive payment to secure their departure. A specific and grim detail of this agreement allowed the Danes to remain through the winter, during which they were granted permission to feed themselves by ravaging the eastern coast. This arrangement spared William's army a winter campaign, but abandoned the English coastal populations to the mercy of the very invaders they had welcomed as liberators. The threat persisted into 1070, when Sweyn II arrived in person, joining forces with Hereward the Wake in the Fens. Once again, William used his treasury to break the alliance, paying Sweyn to return to Denmark and leaving Hereward to face the Norman siege of Ely alone. 5 years later, the Danish claim resurfaced during the revolt of the Earls. This conspiracy was hatched at the Bride Ale of Norwich, the marriage feast of Ralph de Gale and Emma, the sister of Roger de Breteuil. The wedding guests, fueled by wine and resentment toward William's heavy-handed rule, sent for Danish aid. A fleet of 200 ships under Sweyn's son Cnut arrived, but the rebellion had already been suppressed. The Danes settled for plundering York Cathedral before retreating, proving they were still a persistent menace to the stability of the realm. The most formidable challenge arrived in 1085 under King Cnut IV, a ruler determined to restore the full glory of his uncle's empire. Cnut IV organized a gargantuan alliance, gathering over 1,600 ships from Denmark, Flanders, and Norway. The scale of this threat forced William to take unprecedented measures. He quartered thousands of mercenaries across the country and ordered the destruction of coastal resources to deny the invaders sustenance. It was this specific fear of a Danish return that prompted the Domesday Survey. William needed a precise accounting of his kingdom's wealth to fund the defense. At Old Sarum in 1086, he forced his subjects to swear direct oaths of loyalty, fearing that the Anglo-Danish population of the north would defect to Cnut. One 12th century writer, Elnoth of Canterbury, even claimed that William ordered Englishmen to shave their beards and dress in the French fashion to make the population appear more unified and delude the eyes of the invaders. The invasion, however, collapsed from within. Cnut IV had imposed heavy taxes to fund the expedition, sparking a fierce rebellion among his own subjects, who grew restless while the fleet waited in the fjords. In July 1086, while his fleet sat idle, Cnut was cornered and killed by rebels inside the Cathedral of St. Alban in Odense. His death effectively ended the era of large-scale Scandinavian attempts to conquer England. The Scourge of God had been defeated not by Norman steel, but by the internal pressures of the developing Danish state. The Danish claim did not vanish instantly. It became a diplomatic ghost. In 1138, during the Civil War of the Anarchy, King Eric III of Denmark reportedly launched an attack on the English coast, attempting to exploit the chaos between King Stephen and Empress Matilda. Later, in 1193, King Philip II of France married the Danish princess Ingeborg. The contemporary chronicler William of Newburgh suggested that Philip's primary motive was the acquisition of the Danish legal rights to the English throne, which he hoped to use as a tool against Richard the Lionheart. Even into the 13th century, rumors of Danish fleets periodically caused panics in the English court, reflecting a deep-seated cultural memory of the Viking terror. The transition of the Danish claim from a military reality to a footnote mirrored the transformation of England itself. The Normans, though of Viking descent, had become the architects of a continental feudal state. The old North Sea world was being eclipsed by a cross-channel empire that looked toward Paris and Rome rather than Roskilde and Trondheim. The legacy of these final Danish stands remains visible in the Domesday Book and the massive stone keeps of the north, structures built to guard against a return that never came. The era of the Sea Kings had passed, leaving behind a unified English identity forged in the fires of Scandinavian ambition. As the longships were replaced by merchant vessels, the warriors who had sought treasure and glory in the British Isles became participants in a burgeoning international trade network. The final Danish stand was not a failure of courage, but a sign that the medieval world had moved beyond the age of the Viking claim. The Danish invasions began as a psychological shock that shattered the sanctity of the English kingdoms, but they ended by forging a unified nation. From the first blood spilled at Lindisfarne to the sophisticated North Sea empire of Cnut the Great, the Scandinavian presence transformed the British Isles. These invaders left an indelible mark on English language, law, and geography, forcing a fractured collection of kingdoms to evolve into a resilient, centralized state. While the era of the Sea Kings eventually faded, their legacy remains embedded in the fabric of English identity. We are left to consider whether England as we know it could have ever emerged without the transformative crucible of the Viking Age. The story of the Danish invasion is ultimately not just a chronicle of conquest, but the narrative of the birth of a people. Thank you for listening.